Every year, thousands of experts evaluate the status of animal, plant, algae, and fungi species around the world. Using a common language of assessment, they categorize each species' risk of extinction on the IUCN Red List. The Red List provides a barometer of life. And every year, the outlook gets worse. More than 31,000 species are currently threatened with extinction. Most because of human action. But human action can also reverse the Red List trend. So conservationists, governments, and communities around the world are joining forces, activating tried and tested IUCN tools in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can win the fight for our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from Caracas, Venezuela. I can see about 200 people have joined us already. Thank you so much for being here. I can see the people from all over the world. It's really fantastic that you're able to attend this webinar. My name is John Paulo Rodriguez. I chair the IUCN Species Survival Commission, and I'm delighted to introduce Caroline Pollock. She's a senior program coordinator with the Biodiversity Assessment and Knowledge Division within IUCN. She's been in charge. She's been part of the team of the Red List unit for a few years, very experienced. And she will talk to us today about how to apply the IUCN Red List criteria for national Red List assessments, a very, very important topic, one that I'm particularly fond of. If you have, Caroline will have a presentation she will go through. If you have questions, please type them in to the chat box or to the Q&A box. We will be taking them online in writing throughout the presentation. If there's a little bit of time at the end, we'll open the microphones, but we anticipate that most of the questions and interactions will be in writing through the chat box and the Q&A. So welcome everyone. Caroline, over to you. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this as well.
No problem. Thank you, John Paul. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully get the right page. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen now. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. As John Paul says, I'm Caroline Pollock and I work in the IUCN Red List unit in Cambridge in the UK. And I joined the IUCN in 1999, so yes, I've been here for quite a few years now. So this webinar is a follow-up from a webinar that we held last month or the month before, which highlighted the importance of national red lists in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And in that webinar, it highlighted how important the red list is in general, but also how important national red lists are. Now, the IUCN Red List focuses on extinction risk at the global level, and clearly that is a really important issue to highlight and to take notice of at the global level, but also at national and regional levels as well. Now, the Global Red List is based on a series of categories and criteria, which are quantitative categories and criteria, and they were developed in the 1990s precisely to look at the risk of species becoming extinct at the global level. So they were not designed for national level red listing, but there has been a lot of uptake of national level red listings since the 1990s. And it just seems to be soaring in popularity, which is a marvelous thing to see. So one of the things I want to highlight here right at the start is that the IUCN Red List, and in fact any red list, is not only for threatened species. It's an assessment of extinction risk, usually for comprehensive groups where possible, And it looks at every situation from the species now being completely extinct, through it being threatened, to near threatened, and right on to least concern, where it has a relatively low risk of becoming extinct, but it may be stable or it may actually be declining. So it's a very relative and rough guide of extinction risk at the global level. Now, the global level assessments, because we're looking at such a scale, we can't always detect or even highlight the local declines that are happening across the species range. So for widespread species, it's very common for the IUCN Red List to have a species listed as, for example, least concern, meaning it's got the lowest level of the lowest risk of becoming extinct at the global level. But a national red list across any parts of that species range might actually list it as threatened or even worse. So in this example, we have a least concerned species at the global level, but you can see that in parts of its range in Cambodia and Singapore, which you can barely see on this map because it's so small, the species is actually listed as critically endangered. It's vulnerable in Thailand and it's threatened in India. So everywhere else it's least concern, and it's the larger part of the range and the stability in the larger part of the range that is driving the global assessment. But it's really important to start implementing conservation action within Cambodia and Thailand and India for this species, and maybe also in certain other countries if it's least concerned but still declining. So these are the local fine details that have to be picked up in national red lists that the global red list can't always pick up on. It is also possible under one criterion A, which looks at reduction in population size over time. It's possible for the IUCN Red List to list a species as threatened, in this example, endangered, but for a national red list to list it as least concern. So in this scenario, if I can get my thing to work. There we go. In this scenario, it's endangered at the global level, but the national red list of Australia lists it as least concern because it's got a small proportion of the global population and it just happens to be stable and doing absolutely fine in that part of its range. Elsewhere, it is endangered, and that is what's driving the global assessment. So it's really important to have that finer level detail, and that comes out through national red listing, which helps the global status, it helps to save species. So it's really good to see that national red lists are springing up all over the world. Now, please don't get upset if your national red list doesn't appear in this map. It is not by any means a comprehensive list of all national red lists. There are many, many more. I just didn't have a whole year to put all the little icons on this map. So some of the current national red lists use the IUCN Red List Criteria, which is fantastic. Some don't, but that is actually okay because we can't enforce that. But we do encourage the IUCN Red List Criteria being used because it provides a standardized system, and you can then compare national red lists between countries because you're using the same process, the same methodology. Some of these national red lists include some documentation. Some include lots of documentation, some have very minimal information. It might just be a name and a category. Some are kept updated and some are not as well. Some are quite old and out of date, but different countries have different resources and different capacities to keep this process going on. So there's a whole mixed bag of quality of national red lists here, and I'm really here today to help you to understand how to apply the red list criteria for your national red list process, and hopefully to encourage you to take that step to start applying the criteria in your own countries. Now, when we start to look at red listing at a scale that's smaller than the global level, you start to find certain challenges that we don't face in the IUCN Red List very often. So basically, the smaller the area and the more wide-ranging or highly dispersive species you have that you're assessing, then the more often the national population will have an interchange with populations outside of that country, and that brings in rescue effects from outside of the area. Now, you're not responsible for those populations outside your country, but you do need to be aware of them and how movement across borders affects the status of your species within your country. So for those particular species, extinction risk assessment using the IUCN criteria will become less reliable without going to that extra step to consider the influence of populations outside of your country. Now, IUCN cannot provide specific guidance on this because it really depends on the species you're assessing. Is it highly mobile or is it really very static? It depends on the nature of the country. You might have a very small country, like, for example, Luxembourg, which is completely surrounded by other countries, and therefore there's a lot of rescue effect from neighbouring countries. Or you might be dealing with somewhere like New Caledonia, which is also a relatively small country, but it's in the middle of the ocean. It takes species an extra effort to get to and from that country and other countries. And it also depends on barriers, any barriers to dispersal. Is the species country landlocked, but are there large mountains around the whole edge of the country, and that causes a barrier for species to disperse. So it's really a case-by-case basis, and countries need to make certain decisions on how they apply the criteria for themselves. I'm going to go through some of those today. So you may have a population occurring in your country, and you'll notice that I will focus a lot on Cambodia as an example throughout this whole presentation. So you may have a population that extends beyond the border into another country. It's a continuous kind of meta-population that crosses a border. So in this example, we've got the population in Cambodia, but it also extends into Vietnam. So you need to consider what is happening in Vietnam and how that affects your population within Cambodia. You may be assessing a species that doesn't breed within your country, but uses important resources for its non-breeding season, or it may even be a passage country between breeding and non-breeding areas. So again, looking at Cambodia, you may have a species with a non-breeding range occurring here and breeding ranges in North Asia. For those migratory type species, you may even have lots of mixing of populations that actually spend their non-breeding times in totally different countries, but they go to the breeding areas and they mix. So there's a lot of genetic mixing going on. So you may also have to consider what is happening in these other countries, these other non-breeding areas. So you have to think very carefully through the whole scenario. Your country may hold a very small proportion of the global population. So again, going back to Cambodia, different species, different range. But if you look at the global range of this species, it is very widespread. And actually Cambodia, in this example, might hold less than 5%, maybe even less than 3% of the global population. So you then have to decide, are we going to include that on a national red list or not? You may have a population that is what we call a sink, and that means it relies on immigration of individuals or seed or larvae from outside of the region. So in this example, we're relying on the movement of individuals or larvae or seed from Vietnam into Cambodia, and without that, the population in Cambodia dwindles and disappears. So that's a sink population. Which leads on to the next question: how do you highlight nationally extinct species in a national red list? Because that category doesn't exist in the IUCN categories and criteria. So here we've got population is extinct in Cambodia, but it still exists in the wild outside of Cambodia. And you have other questions about what to do with introduced species, how do you treat vagrants, etc. So at the global level, I highlighted that we use the IUCN categories and criteria, and they were developed precisely for the purpose of looking at global risk of extinction. These categories and criteria cannot be updated very easily. They cannot be modified because that opens up a whole process that is it could drag on for many, many years to change the rules. And it would also end up with a new set of criteria that would maybe not be so comparable with previous assessments. So it would be a massive amount of work to tie everything together. So to get over this issue, because every time we start assessing new taxonomic groups, IUCN starts to learn some big lessons as to where the criteria are not as obvious to apply as they should be. So to get over this hurdle, we developed the guidelines for using the IUCN Red List categories and criteria, the Red List guidelines we call them. And that document gets updated regularly. It was actually last updated earlier this month, just to tidy up a few loose points in it. So that gets regularly updated, and we use these two documents together for global Red List assessments. For national and regional Red List assessments, because we do also do regional assessments for Europe, Mediterranean, etc. For all of those national and regional Red List assessments, all three of these documents need to be referred to. So it's not just the guidelines for application at regional and national levels, it's that regional guidelines document plus the categories and criteria plus the Red List guidelines. Now, all of these documents are available from the IUCN website, and I'll come back to that right at the end of the presentation. So, categories. Now, I'm not going to train you all into how to apply all of the categories and criteria and the key terms and everything. That takes a 4-day training session. We only have an hour. So just to highlight that at the global level, we have 9 Red List categories, ranging from worst case scenario, the species is gone entirely, it's extinct, or it's extinct in the wild. The 3 threatened categories, near threatened, meaning it's not quite threatened, but it's nearly there, least concern, the lowest risk of extinction, then data deficient and not evaluated. For the regional level, we have 2 extra categories. So we've got the regionally extinct category, and that deals with the situation where you have something that is native to your country. It has now become extinct within your country, but still exists in the wild outside. So it's the Cambodia example I showed you earlier on. And then we have a not applicable category, which means you have actively looked at this species, you've considered it for your national red list because it occurs within your country, but you have decided it's not applicable for your national red list for some reason. Now, what reasons might those be? I'll go into that in the next slide. So looking back, just a very rough scale overview of the national red list assessment process. It's basically a 3-step process. Step one, you have to identify what those not applicable taxa are. So which species are going into this, you've considered, but you're putting them into a side list of the acknowledging they occur in your country, but you're not including them. Then you do a preliminary assessment in step 2, and in this you apply the red list criteria to your national population. And then step 3, you look at what are the effects of populations existing outside of your country, and you can adjust your preliminary assessment accordingly. And then you've got your final national red list assessment. Now, those 3 steps form the national red list process itself. Beyond the national red list, there is the conservation priority setting process. Now, that includes other factors. It's a really important point that your national red list is not your final list of all conservation priority species. It's just one tool, one very important and essential tool in the process of setting conservation priorities. And you might want to look at the cultural significance of your species, or funding availability to pour into conserving one particular species, or is it better to spread that across a range of different species, or a particular ecosystem or habitat which will benefit many of these species, or is it a commercially important species? There's a whole suite of different tools that you need to use to feed into conservation priority setting, not just the red list. Okay, so step 1, not applicable. Not applicable species occur within your country, but they are not eligible for a national assessment. How do you identify those species? Well, typically, you would exclude things like introduced species. It's not indigenous to the country, it's not native, it's been introduced for some reason other than for conservation. So it might be introduced for commercial purposes, it may have been accidentally introduced. For whatever reason, it's there and it shouldn't really be there. So the example I've shown here, and please note this photograph is probably not the species that I'm showing in the example, it's just the only photograph I had of a mimosa. So the Mimosa pigra, you would not consider that as eligible for an assessment in the National Red List of Cambodia because it is an introduced alien invasive species. So it would be not applicable. Vagrant species, again, they're not indigenous to the country. They occur occasionally, sporadically, irregularly. You can't predict when they're going to turn up. Those would go into a not applicable list for a national red list. So an example here is Zepornia pusilla, this lovely little bird. Occasionally occurs in Denmark, but it would not be considered applicable for the national red list because it's a vagrant and it occurs there unpredictably. But then there are some grey areas in this process because different countries might decide to approach the topic in a different way. So we have optional filters that countries might decide to use to help them decide what is not applicable and what is applicable for the national assessment. So typical examples would be you might decide on a particular year to help you decide what is considered introduced and would therefore be not applicable, or it was introduced to the area so long ago that actually it's now accepted as part of the natural fauna and flora of the country. So it's naturalized to the area. Now, many European countries use the year 1800 as a cutoff point. Anything introduced after 1800 would be not applicable because it's introduced too recently. Anything introduced before 1800 is just part of the natural fauna and flora now, so they'll include it in the national red list. The proportion, you may decide that for your national red list, you are not going to include anything that has only less than 1% of the global population occurring in your country, or you might decide to assess absolutely everything. Here in the UK, we tend to assess everything. Other countries, they set a proportion, it might be 1%, it might be 3%. It's entirely up to that country. Or you may decide that the global red list status is of prime importance. So anything that, even if you have a proportion filter and your species has, say, 0.5% of the global population occurring there, if it's assessed as threatened on the IUCN Red List, you're going to include it anyway. So you may or may not use that as a type of filter. Whichever filter you use, it is entirely optional. IUCN can't advise, well, we can't strictly say you must use all these filters because every country will have a different situation. You're different areas, different sizes, different borders, different history of people coming and going from that country. So those decisions have to be made by the authority managing the national red list process. There are no strict rules, but do be clear about any filters you set and do make sure they are visible somewhere so people can actually see what filters you've used, and try and be consistent as well amongst all of your assessments. Don't use different filters for reptiles versus birds versus amphibians. Apply the same filters across all taxa so you have a standard system in place. Now, I'm not going to go through this flow diagram. I just want to highlight that it is there in the regional guidelines on page 40. It's a flow diagram which basically helps you through this process of identifying what is applicable for your national red list and what is not applicable. And it very much refers to optional filters. So you have to decide on the filters and then go through this flow diagram to help you. Okay, so we've done step one. We have our nice list of not applicable species. We're now into step two. In step two, you have to do a preliminary assessment. Now we're going back to Cambodia for this example. Here we have a species which occurs in Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand and probably beyond as well. But these are the neighbouring countries. For step two, we want you to ignore all populations occurring outside the country, just temporarily, pretend they don't exist, and then apply the red list criteria to the data you have within your country. So for this process, you're going to have to compile all available data for populations occurring within, for example, Cambodia. And you're looking for data that will tell you what is the extent of occurrence and area of occupancy of that species within Cambodia. What is the population size? What are the trends? What are the threats affecting that species? You'll need that to be able to determine number of locations. What is the generation length, which you will need to determine the reduction in population over time? Are there extreme fluctuations? Are there data for quantitative analysis, for probability of extinction? All of these are key terms that are used in the global Red List categories and criteria, and you will need to refer to the Red List guidelines document to help you to pull that information together and to calculate these parameters in an appropriate way. So you've got all your data, and now you can assess the species using the IUCN Red List criteria and the regional guidelines, because remember, you've got those two extra categories, regionally extinct and not, well, you've already done not applicable, but regionally extinct you need to consider in your step 2 assessment. So ignoring everything outside of your country, you now have a preliminary assessment. Step 3, you're now into the final national assessment, and this is where it can get a little bit tricky, because you're now having to consider what is happening outside of your country. Where are the nearest populations? Is there immigration happening? Are we relying on that immigration? How is it affecting the population within, in this case, Cambodia? And this is where you would rely entirely on the regional guidelines. This is where all the guidance is on how to deal with all these questions. So is there immigration of propagules, and I mean individuals or seed or eggs or larvae that is likely to come into Cambodia in this case and rescue the national population should it start to decline? So here we've got the nearest populations in Thailand and Vietnam. There is actually immigration happening. If this immigration were to stop or decrease, how would that affect the national population within Cambodia? So in this example, if we start having local extinctions happening in just across the border of Cambodia, and that stops the immigration from Thailand and it reduces the immigration from Vietnam, how does that affect Cambodia? Well, it could affect it in this kind of way, where you start to see populations declining within Cambodia. So that has to be considered in your final assessment. And you would adjust the preliminary category appropriately to get your final national assessment. Now, in pages 15 to 20 of the regional guidelines, you've got these 2 flow diagrams and a whole table of associated questions which help you to adjust that preliminary category if necessary. And I'm going to go through these 2 diagrams in the next few slides. So now we've got slightly different approaches for the situation where you're assessing a breeding population versus assessing a non-breeding population, a visiting population. So we'll go through the breeding population first. It's a series of questions you have to answer, and it's not always easy to get the answers, but you do need to think very carefully about where you can find the information to reach a conclusion on each of these questions. So it does take a bit of legwork, and it does mean talking to your neighbouring countries, people that are working on other national red lists. So first question, does the national population experience any significant immigration of propagules likely to reproduce in the region? Now, for this question, you need to consider these other questions. Is it part of a metapopulation that includes groups, conspecific groups in other countries? Is this species capable of very long distance dispersal? Are there any barriers preventing that dispersal from happening? Are there any local adaptations preventing those individuals from settling and reproducing in your country? So there might be immigration, but are those individuals actually contributing to your population, or are they just not able to settle there at all? If the answer to that question, after you've done all your research and you conclude, well, actually, no, there is no immigration at all, then there's no change from step 2. This would be a situation for endemic species because it only occurs within that one country. There are no extra regional or any other populations outside to affect that assessment. So at endemic species, just 3A, no change. And your preliminary assessment is exactly the same as your final assessment. So in this example, your preliminary assessment was endangered, your final assessment is endangered. If you conclude that actually there is some immigration of propagules coming in that could likely settle within your region, you then ask, what is happening outside? Is this immigration expected to decrease over time? Is it decreasing now, in fact? So you're asking yourself, are there neighbouring populations? Are they within dispersal distance? Are they stable? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Is this species listed in a neighbouring country's red list already? Is it already threatened? If so, why? What are the significant threats? How are those threats going to affect the populations that are contributing to your national population? So you'll have to start talking to your neighbours for this. If the conclusion to question 3B is no, or it's unlikely, then you've got immigration happening, but it's likely going to continue. Then your initial preliminary assessment actually overestimated your current extinction risk because it didn't take into account this rescue effect. If you're starting to lose individuals within your country, but you've got this constant flow of immigration to replace those individuals, then that rescue effect will cause you to downlist your preliminary category by at least one category. So in this example, you've got preliminary assessment is endangered, final national assessment is vulnerable. And notice this little degree sign, this little note. This is we recommend that you have some kind of annotation to your final assessment to highlight cases where there's been this change from the preliminary category to the final category. The criteria carry across exactly the same, but it's just that final category that gets noted with a little asterisk or a degree sign or some other kind of annotation. This is just to let people know that actually external influences have affected this final assessment. Okay, going back to our question 3B, if your conclusion is yes, there is immigration, that immigration is expected to decrease, then ask how much is your national population relying on immigration from across the border? Is it a sink? The answer to that is no. So this immigration, it is expected to decrease, but our regional population is not heavily relying on that constant flow of individuals. Then you follow this line down through no, and you go to no change from step 2. So your preliminary assessment in this case will not change because you've already considered all these factors in your preliminary assessment. You might not have been thinking about them, but they have already been included, and you would have seen the decline happening in your population already. If your conclusion to answer 3C is yes, then it is in a much more serious way than you thought before. So there's immigration happening, it's decreasing, your population is relying on that immigration, then you'll need to uplist your category because your preliminary assessment actually underestimated the current extinction risk for that species. So if your preliminary assessment was endangered, your final national assessment might end up being critically endangered because of this reliance on external populations coming into your country. And again, we've got this little annotation to highlight that change. So that's breeding populations. Now, non-breeding populations are a bit different because your preliminary assessment already, in a way, it has considered what's happening outside of your borders. You haven't been thinking about it, but the consequences of declines outside are being reflected within your country because those individuals are actively coming into your country. So if they're declining outside, you'll see them start to decline within your country. So the questions are a bit different. Again, you do your preliminary assessment and you've got your, say, endangered assessment. Ask the question, are the conditions outside of the region deteriorating? So think about the population in the breeding areas. Think about the populations that are in stopover areas. Is that breeding population declining? Are the conditions and habitat declining in the breeding areas or at the stopover areas? Are fewer individuals reaching your country? If your conclusion is yes, then you don't change your preliminary category because you have already subconsciously considered that in your preliminary assessment. If the answer is no or unlikely, then go back to conditions within your region. This is a bit of a cross-check really, because you have already considered this in your preliminary assessment. What's happening to the population in your country? Are the habitat and other conditions within the country stable or deteriorating? Are they projected to decline in the near future as well? The answer to that is yes. Then again, you've already considered it. It's just an extra step of reconsidering it and making sure you got it right. No change from your preliminary assessment. If the answer is no, then can the breeding population rescue the regional population should population start declining within your country? This is a bit of a complicated question, but basically you're asking, is the breeding population somewhere outside of your country very small and very restricted? So if you start losing individuals within your country, the breeding population itself is so small that it's not going to be able to rescue that population. Or is the breeding population massive? Is it substantial, covering a wide area? Are the breeding conditions not deteriorating? Are they all stable? Absolutely fine. So you may have a small visiting population, and if it starts to decline, then there is a bank of breeding individuals outside that can replace those individuals that are being lost within your country. So that in effect is a rescue effect. If the answer to this question is no, so you've got a very small breeding population, it cannot rescue your regional population, then there's no change. And again, you keep your preliminary assessment. So if it was endangered at the preliminary stage, it's endangered at the final stage. But if the answer to this is yes, then that is a rescue effect. So you would downlist from your preliminary category. So again, you've got preliminary assessment of endangered. Your final national assessment would be vulnerable, with a little annotation to say this is because of what's happening outside. Okay. Now that's the three-step process. It sounds quite straightforward, and actually in theory it is quite straightforward, but it does take legwork. Try not to just assume there's no information outside of your country. Try and make the effort to talk to colleagues in other countries to find out what's going on, and it will help you to answer those questions and get your regional adjustment just right. So what about documentation and supporting information for national assessments? Well, I'm going to compare the global and the national assessment situation here. For a global assessment on the IUCN Red List, there are a series of required supporting information that has to come along with every global assessment that we process on the national and the global Red List. So first, of course, you have to have the Red List category and criteria. So the code for the category and the code for the criteria. And that needs to be supported by information in form of text and codes. We have classification scheme codes for threats, habitats, conservation actions, etc. But we also expect text. All of the assessments on the IUCN Red List are like miniature scientific papers, and they get published as a standalone PDF, every single one of them, all over 140,000 of them, nearly 150,000 of them now. So we need these assessments to be written out in a scientific way. So they need to include a rationale to justify why you've chosen that category and criteria for your species. You need to explain what the geographic range is. There needs to be information on population, whether it's size, trends, reduction, or an explanation of why there's no such information available. Information on habitats and ecology, threats, use and trade, conservation actions, and there needs to be a full list of all references cited within that assessment, just like a scientific paper, just a bit shorter. And of course, we require a distribution map for all assessments on the IUCN Red List as well. On the website, we've got documents that you can download that explain how to what the mapping standards are for all maps being submitted to us, and what supporting information we require, and what supporting information is recommended, and how to write an assessment as well. So all of that is in the supporting information guidelines and the mapping standards guidelines. For national assessments, now IUCN does not own or police national red lists. We can only make recommendations, but we make them based on experience. And we have many, many years of experience of doing global assessments to know what is useful when it comes to doing initial assessments and then doing reassessments and calculating things like red list index and changes in category over time. So we would recommend that for national red lists, you include the red list category and criteria at both the national level, so your final national assessment, and at the global level. So it gives you a bit of context. Something might be least concern at the global level, but it might be critically endangered in your country. So it's good to see that contrast in assessments. It also helps to have the estimated proportion of the global population occurring within your country. So yes, it might be least concern at the global level, and it might be vulnerable at your national level, but actually you might have 40% of the global population and it's vulnerable. So maybe there's something there that you need to be telling us in the Red List unit or the network of SSC members to adjust the global level assessment, because maybe it's not quite right. Or maybe it's just that in that other 60% of the global range, actually everything's a bit more stable and there needs to be more effort within that country to make sure that population gets back on an even keel again. We recommend that there is some supporting information for national assessments. Now, we can't enforce all the supporting information that we require at the global level for all national assessments, but we do recommend that that information is included somewhere. It might not be practical to include it in a printed version of a national red list, because printing costs are quite high, and we don't want to waste too much paper. But if that information is at least available on an online national red list website, or in an easily accessible database somewhere, then it really will help the people that then have to reassess those species in the future, because they'll see what your assessment is actually based on. And it's really important that you know what people did before, so that you can update it and correct it if possible as well, refine it. In the introduction section of any national red list, we would always recommend that you have a section that discusses what taxonomic groups are being assessed for the national red list, because it's not always all species. It might be a national red list of birds or butterflies or plants or trees or a whole range of different things. So do discuss the taxonomic groups that you're assessing, the taxonomic standards you've followed, because they might differ between the national red list and the global red list, or between different national red lists. You might have the same species being referred to, but you might actually be referring to a slightly different concept. It's really important to understand that. And to explain any national level filters that you've used in your national red list as well. Now, before this webinar, I was doing a bit of research trying to find some examples of national filters that are used by different national red list authorities. And I actually found it really difficult to find examples, because that information seems to be sort of hidden. So I would really beg you to make sure that this information is up there somewhere and very clear and transparent for people to understand how you've reached those conclusions for your national red list. And also don't forget the list of not applicable species. So you'll have all your species that you've assessed, and you've gone to a great deal of effort to do that. But it's also good to have an acknowledgement of the other species which occur in your country, but you've decided not to include in your national assessment. Now, there's a whole section in the regional guidelines which talks about documentation for national red list assessments. So there's a lot more that we recommend than these points. These are just the main points that I wanted to highlight today. One further point is that for endemic species assessments, we strongly encourage you to submit those for publication on the IUCN Red List, because those are global assessments. Your species doesn't occur elsewhere. You're holding the whole global population. It's really important to get that acknowledged in the global Red List. Now, of course, for this, they must include the required supporting information for global assessments. So all endemic species that you're going to submit to the Red List, they must include everything that we require for a global level assessment. And when we receive such assessments, we will make sure they go through the appropriate review process at the global level as well. Okay, so what do we have to help you? There are lots of different tools and resources out there. So there's the National Red List website at this address here. Now, the National Red List website has been going for quite a few years now. It's currently managed by the Institute of Zoology in London. It is a directory of all current national and regional red lists, as long as those red lists have been submitted to the National Red List website. It has contact details for other national red list focal points, and it has been a focus for the IUCN SSC National Red List Working Group, of which I'm part of as well. Now, this National Red List website is currently being revised. There's a lot of work going on in the background, and we're hoping that sometime in the near future it will be launched as a brand new website with a functional database in the background. I'm sure one of our future webinars will touch on this point as well. So do use that resource, it's very useful. IUCN itself has a worldwide network of regional and country offices, and you can find a list of those offices on the IUCN Red List the IUCN website, not the Red List website. A point here right now, the IUCN main website has actually gone through a revision to update all of the links and all of the pages. So it's just very recently been launched as a new website. So there may be some links on that website at the moment which are not quite functional, but please be patient with my colleagues in IUCN because they are working to get those pages up and running again. So do bear that in mind, but the resource is there at the moment. And of course, there is the IUCN Red List website itself, which is separate from the main IUCN website. We have the general email address here, but of course, you're welcome to just email anybody within the Red List unit, and we will help you with any questions that you might have. So the guidelines are available in the resources and publications section of the Red List website. So you go to the website and click on this link at the top. It will take you to this page, and this has a huge number of resources here. There are guidelines and documents and graphs and pages, all sorts of things. And if you don't know the website, it can be a bit difficult to find your way through. So the easiest thing to do here is type the word guidelines into the text box, and it will filter all of the resources to just things that are tagged as guidelines. And we have made sure that the important documents that you need are tagged with that word. So type in guidelines and you'll quickly see where to download the categories and criteria, the Red List guidelines and the regional guidelines as well. And there'll be other guidelines as well. We do have some of these documents in other languages. So we've got them in French and Spanish. I very recently uploaded the Red List guidelines in Portuguese as well, thanks to the Centre for Species Survival in Brazil. So yeah, all those guidelines are there in one place. We also have some regional assessments on the Red List website. It's not usually what we do, is work on regional or national assessments. We usually focus at the global level, but we do get involved in some regional and national projects. And currently on the Red List website, we've got assessments for Europe. So if you look down at the bottom left of the screen, you've got Europe or Mediterranean or Pan-Africa. You can also click on the advanced search here, to get the regional assessments. You can also just type in the name of a species in the Red List website. And if there is a regional assessment, it will be listed before you even click on the search button. It will just give you a list of all the assessments you've got. So here we've got a type of dragon damselfly, and it has a global assessment and has a European assessment. You can click on that link and it will take you straight to the European assessment. So that might help you if you're doing a national red list in Europe. It might just give you an idea of what's the regional status, are there any links to other national red lists, just there to help you. Okay, so I think that's all I've got to say today about national red lists and using the guidelines. I'm happy to open up the floor to anyone that has any questions for the last 10 minutes that we've got, I think.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was really very detailed and complete. Thank you, Ned. And also, Janet, thanks so much for all the answers that you have provided in the chat and the Q&A. It's been quite amazing to see you type away madly, furiously. That's great. There are a couple of questions still in the Q&A. Maybe we could address a couple of them.
Yeah.
For example, I'm just going to pick one. Will it be possible for Caroline to give a bit more info on what is meant by national filters? Perhaps there's info in the Red List Guidelines document. Maybe a little expansion of that, please.
National filters. So those are the optional filters that I was talking about earlier. So different countries have different sizes, different history of maybe species being introduced at a certain time. So the national filters are things like if you have to make a decision on whether to assess absolutely everything that occurs within your borders, or to look at it more practically if you've got many species, but some of those species are very small proportions of the global population, then you might not want to focus all your efforts into doing a national assessment for those species, because actually the bulk of the range is somebody else's responsibility, and you've got many other species to have to handle. So it's like a national level decision. Not all countries will use the same filters. Some will use more strict filters than others. It's really just a decision for the national authority.
Thank you. Many people have asked about the recording. The recording will be available of this webinar on the Reverse the Red website. It takes a couple of days usually, but keep your eyes on the website and you will find it. From Basundra Chetri, why most of the amphibians and reptiles of Eastern Himalaya are not evaluated? How do we increase this assessment?
That's a very good question. Well, I would say there's a lot of efforts, certainly within the Species Survival Commission, John Paul, that you know of, and through the Reverse the Red campaign and the plans in future to have national level specialist groups, for example, which might actually help to get momentum to help make those assessments a reality in those particular areas.
Yeah, no, it's a matter of resources, and I agree totally. Yeah. In most of the cases, it's not lack of will, it's certainly just amphibians is one specialist group, for example, and there are thousands of species all over the world, and expertise is very unevenly distributed around the world. So if any of you want to participate and be involved, please reach out to the groups and share your knowledge and your experience with them. There were a couple of questions about Nicola Flanagan. You mentioned that for the National Red List, you should mention the global evaluation. What would you recommend if a global assessment has not been undertaken in that sense?
In that case, in your National Red List, you would say it's not evaluated. So you've looked on the website, the species does not exist there, it's not evaluated. So at the global level, we've got all these different assessment projects going on. Some of them are massive and they just haven't got to those species yet. Others, we just haven't got a specialist group in place to cover that particular taxonomic group. So if the assessment does not appear on the Red List website, just say not evaluated.
Great, thank you. From Chanuka Mahesani, is there any particular time period to do the national assessments? I mean, how frequently should they be done?
Well, at the global level, we recommend that assessors to reassess species at least once every 5 to 10 years. There's no strict rule that we put in place for national red lists, but I would recommend a similar kind of process. It does depend on the resources you've got. Even at the global level, there's some assessments on the red list that are more than 10 years old, because we just haven't had the resources to update them. But the more you update them, the more you're going to be able to detect declines that are happening rapidly, and to be able to put conservation priority setting processes into place to stop that decline from happening. So I would recommend at least once every 5 to 10 years. If declines are happening very noticeably, then you can reassess in between those times. So you can reassess something 3 years after you've done your assessment if you see that it's declining. So there's no hard and fast rule, but just try and do it as regularly as possible.
From Santosh Bhattarai, how can newly described species be assessed? What kind of rules do you have for that?
Oh, as in taxonomic guidelines? Yes. Well, oh gosh. At the global level, again, I can only really speak at the global level. We do have I think a taxonomic working group, is it called? I think, John Paul, you know more about this than I do, I think, which is supposed to be up and running and to talk about what taxonomic standards we use at the global level. But we can't really prescribe what each country does, because each country, taxonomy is a very complicated thing, and each country can often have a very different concept for the same species as we have on the global red list. So that's why I said in the documentation for your national red list, it's really important in the introduction to not only say that you're assessing all reptiles for your national red list, but you'll also say what taxonomic standards you have used, so that it's absolutely clear what concept you're using, and people looking at that, comparing your red list with a neighbouring national red list, will be able to see if it's the same concept or not, and also if comparing against the global red list, if it's the same concept or not, and if it's not, then there can be a further discussion. It's not something that's easy to advise on, to be honest.
Yeah, always reach out to your specialist group, you know, the specialist group that has the taxonomic or the species that you're interested in, because ultimately it will be through the Red List Authority coordinator. It will be somebody within the group that will give you guidance and maybe even have to decide. So the last question, there are lots more in the Q&A. Sorry we couldn't cover them all. It's great to see so much interest. You can always reach out to us later and take a look at the recording that will be available in a few days. From Simon Purser, how long does it usually take for an assessment to go live on the Red List website once it has been submitted? Is there a specific review cycle annually per specialist group, or is it kind of based upon when assessments are submitted and the time it takes to review them? So what's the process for that?
Okay, there's quite a lot of factors involved here. So first, if there's an assessment coming from a national red list process and it comes to the red list unit, we need to then make sure that has gone through the appropriate review process, which means sending that assessment out to a red list authority within the SSC network and getting them, they need the time to review it and then to come back to us to say, yes, we're happy with this assessment, or no, we've got a few more questions, and that can delay the process. If everything goes really well and smoothly, then we could have an assessment submitted to us. We could have the review done if it's fairly straightforward within a month, and then we can have it in the queue for the next Red List update. But it also depends on where in the Red List update cycle the assessment comes into us, because we do updates at least twice a year, and we have certain cut-off periods, so we'll need at least 6 weeks before an update where we do nothing at all to any taxonomy or any assessments in our database. And then the six weeks before that we also have a processing kind of time. So it's actually 12 weeks before a Red List update we cut off any more submissions for that update. And if you submit it like 3 weeks before an update, it's not going to go into that Red List. It will be held over for another Red List in future. So again, my answer is a little bit vague, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. There's no set, it will be there within 6 months, because it depends on when in the cycle we get the assessment submitted to us, and it depends on the review process. It also depends in part on staff within the Red List unit, because currently we're down to 6 members of staff, I think. Yeah, 6 plus 1 borrowed. And we're kind of a bit busy and the queue is quite long. But basically your assessment goes to the end of a queue and we work our way through as quickly as we can. But we'll get there as soon as we can. And if there's anything that is super urgent, it's relying on being red listed for conservation action to be implemented, highlight it to us, just contact us, because we can prioritise certain assessments if it's a good enough case. So just please bear that in mind.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karen. It's exactly 10 a.m. here in Caracas. We just completed the hour. Thanks so much, Caroline, for all your contribution, all your information, all your years of dedication to the Red List. And Janet, really fantastic fielding all those questions. Many, many thanks. At one point, I counted 305 people present. I'm not sure what the maximum was, but we had great attendance. Obviously, lots of interest in the topic. So we'll continue talking about national red lists and reversing the red in the years to come. So thank you, everyone. Great to see you. Until next time, thanks again, Caroline and Janet. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.